What does it feel like to be a 33-year-old failure without a husband? My sister asked loudly, tapping her crystal wine glass, while our entire family erupted into laughter. My white brother-in-law even chimed in, offering me a minimum wage job so I would not be a burden. I did not cry. I simply put down my fork, wiped my mouth, and asked a question of my own. What does it feel like when this failure decides to stop paying all of this family's bills? My name is Chloe, and for the last 15 years, I have been the invisible shadow in the Sterling family. We were gathered for our traditional Sunday dinner at my parents' sprawling estate in Atlanta. The dining room smelled of roasted lamb and pound cake, but the atmosphere was thick with the usual toxicity. Jasmine, my older sister, sat across from me wearing a designer dress she could not afford. She leaned back in her carved mahogany chair, swirling her expensive wine and soaking in the attention. She had always been the golden child, the one my parents paraded in front of the church congregation. Beside her sat her husband, Preston. He was a white real estate developer who loved to use his privilege to talk down to me at every opportunity. Preston rolled up the sleeves of his tailored shirt, making sure everyone at the table got a good look at his brand new gold watch. He looked at my simple black sweater and let out a condescending sigh. "You know, Chloe," Preston said, his voice dripping with fake pity, "my firm is looking for a new receptionist. The pay is not great, but it is better than whatever freelance tech support you are doing right now. You could answer phones and schedule my meetings. It would get you out of those cheap clothes and take some of the financial burden off your parents." My mother Beatrice nodded enthusiastically from the head of the table. She adjusted her pearl necklace and gave me a look of deep disappointment. "You should really take Preston up on that offer, Chloe. He is being incredibly generous. Not every woman is lucky enough to snag a top-tier provider like your sister did. You need to stop being so stubborn and accept help. Look at Jasmine and Preston. They just closed on a $2 million mansion in Buckhead. That is what success looks like." My father Desmond carved his meat heavily. He ran Sterling Logistics, a trucking company that supposedly made him a kingpin in our community. He pointed his knife at me. "Your mother is right. This family is about building a legacy. Jasmine and Preston are out here making a name for the Sterling family. Meanwhile, you are 33 years old, living in a small apartment, hiding behind your computer all day. When are you going to stop playing around with these little ideas and get a real career? We have an image to uphold at the church. You are embarrassing us." My younger brother Jamal snickered through a mouthful of food. He was 28, unemployed, and completely useless, but my parents treated him like a prince because he was the only son. Jamal tossed his napkin on the table and joined the firing squad. "Yeah, Chloe, maybe if you dressed better and stopped acting so aggressive all the time, you could find a guy to take care of you. But right now, you are just the family charity case." I looked around the dining room at these people who shared my blood. I looked at their smug faces, their expensive jewelry, and their crystal glasses. My hands resting on my lap did not shake. My heart, which used to ache for their approval, felt absolutely nothing. They thought they were looking at a struggling freelancer who could barely afford rent. They had absolutely no idea that I was the sole founder and chief executive officer of Apex Capital, a private equity firm managing over $1 billion in assets. I let them laugh. I let the sound of their mockery fill the room. Then I reached for my linen napkin and slowly dabbed the corners of my mouth. I placed my fork down with a soft click that somehow cut right through the noise. The room quieted down just a fraction as they waited for my usual defensive response. Instead, I looked directly into Jasmine's eyes and offered a calm, pleasant smile. "What does it feel like to be a failure without a husband?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I am not quite sure, Jasmine. But would you like to know what it feels like when this failure decides to stop paying all of this family's bills?" For 2 agonizing seconds, the dining room was dead silent. The only sound was the soft jazz music playing from the ceiling speakers. Then Preston threw his head back and let out a loud, barking laugh. "Are you out of your mind?" Preston scoffed, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "You pay the bills. That is the most delusional thing I have ever heard. You make $50,000 a year doing tech support or whatever it is you do. Your father owns a multi-million-dollar trucking empire. Jasmine and I are moving into a gated community. Who exactly do you think you are funding?" My mother slammed her hand on the table, her face twisting with rage. "Chloe Sterling, you will apologize to your sister and your brother-in-law right this instant. How dare you bring this attitude into my dining room on a Sunday? You are jealous and bitter, and you are trying to ruin a beautiful evening because you hate your own miserable life. Get on your knees and apologize, or you can pack your bags, get out of my house, and never come back." I did not stand up to leave. I did not apologize. I simply reached into my luxury handbag and pulled out my cell phone. The real dinner was just about to begin. I unlocked the screen and opened my banking application. They wanted to talk about who was funding whom. They wanted to brag about their wealth and their status while treating me like dirt on their expensive shoes. It was time to show them the truth. It was time to show them that the very foundation of their perfect lives rested entirely in the palm of my hand. And all it would take was one single tap of my finger to bring their entire world crashing down around them. My mother Beatrice let out a sharp scoff that echoed through the large dining room. She picked up her crystal wineglass and took a slow sip before shaking her head in complete disbelief. She looked at me as if I were a stain on her expensive imported rug. She told me I was completely delusional. She said I had always been jealous of Jasmine and her perfect life. According to my mother, I was so desperate for attention that I had to invent wild fantasies just to feel important. She reminded everyone at the table that I had always tried to ruin their peaceful Sunday dinners because my own life was so empty and miserable. She told me to stop embarrassing myself before I made things worse. Preston leaned back in his heavy wooden chair and let out a deep, booming laugh. His pale gray eyes danced with amusement as he stared at me across the spread of roasted lamb and expensive side dishes. He shook his head and ran a hand through his hair, acting as though I had just told the funniest joke he had ever heard. He asked the entire table how a struggling freelance tax prep making barely $40,000 a year could possibly think she was paying for a family that owned a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. He pointed out my lack of designer labels and compared them to his custom-tailored suit. He wore his arrogance like a badge of honor, dripping with the kind of unchecked privilege that always made my skin crawl. He reminded me that he and Jasmine were currently closing on a $2 million mansion in the most exclusive neighborhood in Atlanta. He chuckled and asked if I was going to pay their new mortgage with the pennies I scraped together from fixing computer glitches for senior citizens. He told me I was out of my mind and out of my depth. My father Desmond did not find the situation funny at all. He slammed his heavy fist onto the dining table, making the silverware rattle against the fine china. He glared at me with absolute fury. He demanded that I apologize to Preston immediately for my ghetto attitude. He told me that my behavior was exactly why women like me ended up alone and bitter. He reminded me that Preston was a highly respected real estate developer who brought prestige and high society connections to our family. He told me that his company, Sterling Logistics, was a titan in the industry, and that he had spent 30 years building a legacy that I was currently disrespecting. He pointed his finger at my face and ordered me to show some respect to the white son-in-law who actually brought value and status to this household. He said if I did not drop this pathetic act right now, he would make sure I was entirely cut off from the family forever. I sat perfectly still and let his toxic threats wash over me. I did not raise my voice or try to argue with any of them. I did not need to defend myself against people who were completely blind to their own impending ruin. I simply looked down at the screen of my phone. I had the banking application open and ready. I navigated to the specific corporate account that controlled the family finances. I found the platinum tier credit line that my mother treated as her personal piggy bank. I took a slow breath and gently tapped the lock icon on the screen. Less than a second later, a sharp notification sound cut through the tense atmosphere of the dining room. My mother jumped slightly in her seat. She reached for her diamond-encrusted handbag and pulled out her phone. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers swipe across the screen. Her expression of arrogant annoyance instantly morphed into a mask of pure panic. She let out a small gasp and blinked rapidly, staring at the notification as if the words were written in a foreign language. She looked up at my father with wide, terrified eyes. She asked him why her American Express Centurion card had just been locked. She told him the notification said the account was frozen due to the primary account holder revoking all access privileges. My father frowned deeply and pulled out his own phone. He told her he had not touched the account and had no idea what she was talking about. Hai insisted that the card was tied directly to his primary corporate account at Sterling Logistics, and there must be some sort of bank error. He told her to calm down because his company had millions in credit. My mother frantically tapped on her phone, trying to open the banking application to resolve the issue. Her breath hitched in her throat as she read the account details aloud. She said the card was not tied to his corporate account at all. Her voice trembled as she revealed that the primary funding source for her black card was an anonymous limited liability company based out of Delaware. She looked around this table in absolute confusion, asking how this was possible and who was controlling her finances. The country club lifestyle, the weekly spa treatments, and the $1,000 charity donations she made to impress the pastor were suddenly entirely out of her control. I reached into my handbag and pulled out a thick manila folder. I tossed it gently onto the center of the dining table right next to Preston's wine glass. The heavy folder slid across the polished wood and came to a stop. I told my mother to open it. I kept my voice incredibly calm and polite as I explained what was inside. I told them those were the official formation documents and banking records for that anonymous limited liability company. I watched their faces turn pale as I revealed that I was the sole owner and chief executive officer of that company. I watched the reality slowly dawn on them as I explained that every single designer outfit my mother wore, every country club fee she paid, and every luxury vacation she took was funded entirely by the daughter she had just called a failure. The silence in the room was no longer born of shock, but of a creeping, terrifying realization. The balance of power had shifted in the blink of an eye. The woman they had spent years breaking down had been the only thing keeping their fragile empire from collapsing into dust. And now that pillar of support was gone. The heavy silence in the dining room was suddenly shattered by the sound of the heavy oak front door slamming against the wall. Heavy footsteps echoed down the marble hallway. My younger brother Jamal stomped into the dining room, his face twisted in an ugly scowl. He was clutching his smartphone so tightly his knuckles were turning pale white. He did not even notice the thick tension hanging in the air or the pale, terrified expression frozen on our mother's face. Jamal marched straight up to our father and threw his phone onto the dining table, right on top of my limited liability company documents. Jamal demanded to know why his platinum purchasing card had just been declined in front of the entire sales team at the luxury auto dealership. He threw a massive tantrum, complaining that he was trying to put a down payment on a brand new $150,000 sports car, and the bank teller flagged the transaction as unauthorized. He whined that he was deeply humiliated in front of his friends and asked my father why he would freeze his allowance without any warning whatsoever. My father stood up from his chair, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. Desmond Sterling was a man who demanded absolute obedience, and Jamal was currently making a fool of himself in front of the entire family, including the white son-in-law he tried so hard to impress. My father yelled at Jamal, asking him what gave him the right to attempt a six-figure purchase on the corporate logistics account without getting direct approval first. Desmond swore he never authorized a car purchase and told Jamal he was cut off for being so incredibly reckless. Jamal fired back, saying he had been using that specific card for 2 years and nobody ever questioned his spending limits before. He yelled that his friends were waiting outside the dealership right now and that his father needed to call the bank immediately and fix this embarrassing situation. I watched the two men scream at each other. They were so blinded by their own arrogance and entitlement that they did not realize the very ground beneath them had completely eroded. I reached into my luxury handbag for the third time tonight. My hand brushed past my keys and closed around a thick, heavy leather-bound ledger. I pulled it out and set it on the table. The loud thud drew the attention of both my father and my brother, causing them to finally stop shouting. I slid the ledger smoothly across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of Jasmine. I told them to open it. I kept my voice incredibly soft and steady, making sure every single syllable landed with maximum impact. I explained that there was no bank error and there was no corporate misunderstanding today. I looked straight at Jamal and told him the reason his card was declined at the luxury car dealership was because I simply decided I was no longer willing to fund his pathetic gambling and spending habits. Jasmine stared at the leather-bound ledger as if it were a venomous snake about to strike her. She slowly reached out with a shaking hand and flipped open the heavy cover. Her eyes scanned the first page and her breath caught sharply in her throat. I leaned forward and told the entire table exactly what they were looking at. I explained that the ledger contained 5 full years of detailed paid invoices and wire transfers. I told Jamal to look at page 4, where I had personally cleared his $80,000 underground gambling debt so the local bookies would not break his legs in the street. I told my mother to look at page 12, where I had quietly settled her outstanding balances at high-end boutiques because her husband was actually too broke to cover her weekly designer shopping sprees. Then I turned my attention to Jasmine and her supposedly perfect white husband. I told Preston to flip to page 30. I watched his face turn a sickly shade of gray. As I explained that the massive down payment for their brand new $2 million mansion in Buckhead did not come from his brilliant real estate investments. I told everyone in the room that it came from an anonymous wire transfer originating directly from my private wealth management fund. I told them I had been the silent benefactor, keeping the Sterling family afloat for half a decade. I explained how I sat back and watched them parade around Atlanta, pretending to be high society royalty, while they were secretly drowning in massive debt and unpaid bills. I told them I paid for the very food they were eating right now and the expensive roof over their heads. Jasmine shook her head violently, her perfect curls bouncing wildly around her face. She screamed that it was absolutely impossible and that I was nothing but a manipulative liar trying to ruin her evening. She grabbed the pages of the ledger and began ripping them out, tearing the thick paper into shreds and throwing them across the dining table. She yelled that I was trying to destroy her marriage and ruin her life out of pure spite and jealousy. She told everyone not to listen to a single word I said, because I was just a crazy, desperate woman who wanted to tear down a happy, successful family. Preston pushed his heavy wooden chair back with a loud, piercing screech. He stood up to his full height, towering over the table. His face was contorted with absolute rage, and his pale eyes locked onto mine. He stepped around the chairs, closing the distance between us with heavy, threatening steps. He cracked his knuckles and looked down at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. He told me it was time somebody finally put me in my place and taught me how to respect my betters. He raised his hand and stepped right into my personal space, attempting to use his size to physically intimidate me into silence. And now that pillar of support was gone. Preston was the first to break the heavy silence. The realization that an African-American woman he had spent years talking down to was actually the one funding his luxurious lifestyle was too much for his fragile ego to handle. He pushed his heavy wooden dining chair back with a loud, piercing screech that echoed off the high ceilings. He stood up to his full height, towering over the table, and slammed both of his pale hands down flat onto the polished mahogany wood. His face was contorted with absolute rage, the veins in his neck bulging as he glared down at me. He leaned forward, attempting to use his size to physically intimidate me into backing down. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face and told me that I was completely unhinged. He said that this entire ledger was nothing but a pathetic, aggressive stunt, fabricated by an angry, bitter woman who could not stand to see her sister happy. He raised his voice, shouting that I was acting like a ghetto stereotype and that my behavior was exactly why I would always be an outcast in this family. He boasted that he was a highly respected real estate developer in the city of Atlanta, a man with powerful connections, high society friends, and a team of ruthless lawyers who would tear me apart in a courtroom. He threatened to sue me for everything I had, for daring to forge financial documents to defame his character. He told me that his reputation was untouchable and that nobody in his elite circle would ever believe a word from someone like me. I looked up at his flushed, angry face, and for a fleeting second I remembered a family barbecue 5 years ago, where he stood in our backyard loudly mocking my career choices to his friends, while my parents simply nodded along in silent agreement. Back then, I had swallowed my pride and walked away in tears. Today, I did not even flinch. I sat perfectly still, my posture straight, and my expression completely unbothered. I let him yell. I let him hurl his racially coded insults and empty threats until he finally ran out of breath. When he finished, his chest heaving as he glared at me, the dining room was so quiet, I could hear the antique grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. I looked directly into his pale, angry eyes and spoke with a voice as cold and sharp as cracked ice. I told him to take his hands off my table. Preston blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by my complete lack of fear. He scoffed and asked me what I was going to do about it. I smiled a tight, humorless smile. I explained that he was currently standing in a house that I paid for, eating food that I bought, and drinking wine that I funded. I told him that his entire existence was subsidized by my hard work. Jasmine immediately jumped to her husband's defense. She grabbed his arm and shrieked that I was a jealous liar. She yelled that Preston was a self-made millionaire who had built his real estate firm from the ground up, and that he did not need a single dime from a miserable, lonely woman like me. She demanded that our father step in and kick me out of the house for disrespecting her husband. Desmond opened his mouth to shout another command, but I did not even give him the chance to speak. I turned my attention back to Preston and began to verbally dismantle his carefully constructed illusion of wealth. I kept my tone conversational, as if we were discussing the weather, rather than his impending ruin. I told him that I found his threats of legal action incredibly amusing, considering he could not even afford to pay the retainer for his supposed high-priced lawyers. I pointed out the custom-tailored Italian suit he was wearing and mentioned the exact date his credit card had declined when he tried to buy a matching tie. I looked at the heavy gold watch gleaming on his wrist, the one he loved to flash in my face to remind me of his status. I calmly informed the entire table that he did not even own that watch. I explained that it was a leased asset and that he was currently 3 months behind on the payments. Preston's face drained of color. The arrogant sneer vanished from his lips, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. He opened his mouth to deny it, but no words came out. He looked around the room, realizing that his confident, untouchable facade was rapidly crumbling in front of the very family he had worked so hard to impress. He tried to puff out his chest and regain his dominant posture, but the damage was already done. The truth was out in the open, and there was nowhere for him to hide. I reached into my luxury handbag for the 4th time that evening. The sound of the zipper opening seemed to echo like a gunshot in the silent room. Everyone at the table froze, their eyes locked onto my hands. They were terrified of what I might pull out next. They had just watched me destroy their financial security and expose their deepest secrets, and they knew I was far from finished. I slowly pulled out a second manila folder, this one significantly thicker than the first. I set it down on the table with a heavy thud. I placed my hand on top of the smooth paper and looked right at the man who had just called me an unhinged failure. I told the room that this specific folder had Preston's name printed in bold black ink right across the front. Jasmine did not even wait for me to open the folder before she started screaming. She slammed her hands onto the table and leaned forward, her face twisted with a mixture of fear and pure rage. She told me I was a sick, bitter woman who had spent my entire life being lonely and miserable. She said I was so desperate to destroy her happiness that I was willing to fabricate documents just to ruin her perfect marriage. She bragged that Preston was a faithful, loving husband who provided her with a beautiful life in Atlanta high society. She insisted that he loved her deeply and that he would never keep secrets from her, let alone face financial ruin. She told the entire table that I was just a jealous outcast, trying to tear down the only successful relationship in the family because no man would ever look twice at a failure like me. I let her scream, her throat raw. I listened to her defend a man who was nothing but a parasite feeding off her blind loyalty. I did not raise my voice or offer any emotional reaction to her cruel insults. I simply placed my hand on the thick folder that bore her husband's name. I slowly flipped open the heavy manila cover and reached inside. I did not pull out more banking ledgers or complicated tax returns. Instead, I pulled out a thick stack of high-resolution 8x10 glossy photographs. I fanned the photographs out across the roasted lamb and the spilled wine, making sure every single person at the table had a perfectly clear view. I watched the blood completely drain from Preston's face as his darkest secrets were laid bare under the bright dining room chandelier. The first photograph showed Preston sitting on the balcony of a luxury penthouse in Paris, overlooking the Eiffel Tower. He was wearing a plush white robe and holding a glass of expensive champagne. Sitting on his lap with her arms wrapped tightly around his neck was a stunning 23-year-old blonde model. The second photograph showed the two of them walking hand in hand out of a high-end designer boutique on the Champs-Élysées. The third photograph captured them kissing passionately on the deck of a private yacht in the south of France. Jasmine stared at the glossy images and her breathing became erratic. Her eyes darted wildly from the photographs to her husband and back again. She shook her head in frantic denial, insisting that the pictures had to be manipulated or doctored. She stammered that Preston had been in Europe for a highly important real estate conference last month, and that the woman in the photos was probably just an aggressive client or a business associate. She was desperately clinging to the illusion of her perfect marriage, refusing to believe that the man she worshipped had completely betrayed her. I looked at my sister with a calm, terrifying pity. I told her that the woman in the photographs was not a business associate. I explained that her name was Lexi, and that Preston had been funding her lavish European lifestyle for the past 2 years. I told Jasmine that Preston had paid for Lexi's luxury apartment in Paris, her designer wardrobe, and her first-class travel expenses. Jasmine choked back a sob and turned to her husband, demanding that he tell her this was all a lie. Preston sat frozen in his chair, his jaw trembling as he stared at the photographic evidence of his infidelity. He could not speak. The arrogant smirk he had worn all evening was entirely gone, replaced by the pathetic look of a coward who had finally been caught. But I was not finished. I told Jasmine that the most disgusting part of this betrayal was not the fact that her husband was sleeping with a model in Paris. It was how he was paying for it. I reached back into the folder and pulled out a stack of bank transfer receipts printed on heavy, secure paper. I slid them across the table, stopping them right next to the photographs. I asked my father Desmond to look closely at the routing numbers on those receipts. I explained that Preston did not use his own money to fund his mistress's luxurious lifestyle because his real estate firm had been secretly bankrupt for 24 months. Instead, he needed a reliable source of cash that nobody would question. I told the table that Preston had systematically hacked into the private trust fund that our father had set up for Jasmine. He had been quietly draining her future security month after month, transferring hundreds of thousands of dollars into offshore accounts to pay for romantic getaways with another woman. The sound that escaped Jasmine's throat was something between a gasp and a dying scream. The reality of the ultimate betrayal crashed down on her all at once. The husband she had flaunted, the marriage she had used to make me feel inadequate, and the wealth she had bragged about were all built on a foundation of theft and infidelity. She turned to Preston and began screaming hysterically, beating her fists against his chest and demanding to know how he could steal her future to sleep with a child. Preston tried to grab her wrists, stammering pathetic excuses and begging her to calm down and listen to him. The dining room descended into absolute chaos. Jamal was staring at the photos with his mouth wide open. Jasmine was weeping uncontrollably while Preston tried to physically restrain her. I sat back and watched the destruction unfold, waiting for my parents to step in and throw the cheating, lying thief out of their house. I waited for my father to defend his golden daughter and banish the man who had stolen her trust fund. But the reaction from my parents was the most sickening twist of the entire evening. Desmond did not yell at Preston. Beatrice did not rush to comfort her sobbing daughter. Instead, my parents exchanged a long, panicked look filled with calculated desperation. They looked at the photographs, then at the screaming couple, and finally they turned their absolute fury toward me. My father Desmond pushed himself up from the head of the table. His massive frame cast a long, dark shadow over the ruined dinner. I fully expected him to grab Preston by the collar and throw him out into the street for disrespecting his daughter. I expected a father to protect his child. Instead, Desmond pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. His voice boomed through the dining room, echoing off the high ceilings as he demanded to know what was wrong with me. He yelled that I had deliberately brought shame into his house on the Holy Sunday. He screamed that I was a vindictive, evil woman who had spent months plotting to destroy my own sister's happiness, just because I was too bitter to find a man of my own. I sat there completely stunned as my father turned his attention to Jasmine, who was still sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. He did not offer her a warm embrace. He did not tell her that she deserved better. Desmond looked down at his golden daughter and told her to stop making such a pathetic scene. He ordered her to wipe her face and act like a proper high society wife. He looked right at Preston, who was still sweating and trembling, and gave him a curt, understanding nod. My father looked back at Jasmine and told her that highly successful men sometimes had minor indiscretions. He said that Preston was under a massive amount of pressure, providing for her luxurious lifestyle, and that she needed to be more forgiving. He told her that they were the face of the Sterling family at their megachurch, and that an ugly public divorce would ruin their standing in the Atlanta community. My mother Beatrice immediately chimed in to support this absolute madness. She reached across the table and grabbed Jasmine's shaking hand. Beatrice told her daughter that men had physical needs and that a smart woman learns how to look the other way to protect her wealthy lifestyle. She reminded Jasmine about the $2 million mansion in Buckhead and asked her if she really wanted to throw away a perfectly good marriage over a meaningless fling in Paris. Beatrice said that Preston was a highly respected white real estate developer and that his presence elevated the entire Sterling family. She actually told Jasmine to apologize to Preston for screaming at him and to pray for God to heal their marriage. She then turned her furious glare back to me and accused me of being the actual devil sent to test their faith. The sheer audacity of their reaction was almost too much to comprehend. My parents were willingly sacrificing their own daughter's dignity and financial future just to maintain the fake illusion of high society wealth. They were literally siding with a cheating, fraudulent white man who had stolen from their own bloodline simply because he looked good in family photographs. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long, slow breath. I raised my hands and began to clap. The slow, sarcastic clapping sound cut through Jasmine's pathetic weeping and my parents' toxic lectures. I clapped slowly and methodically, letting the sharp sound echo across the room. I told them that they truly deserved an Academy Award for the most pathetic display of parenting I had ever witnessed in my entire life. I said I was completely disgusted but absolutely not surprised by their horrifying betrayal. I looked at my father and asked him how it felt to sell his own daughter's soul just to keep up appearances for a pastor who did not even care about them. I asked my mother how she could look at herself in the mirror, knowing she was begging her child to stay with a man who was using her stolen trust fund to sleep with a 23-year-old model. I told them that their moral compass was completely bankrupt. I said they were so obsessed with the illusion of wealth and status that they would rather let a parasite drain them dry than admit they had made a mistake. I told Jasmine that she was pathetic for sitting there and accepting it just because she was terrified of losing her designer handbags and country club memberships. Desmond slammed his fist on the table again, refusing to let me have the last word. He told me to shut my mouth and pack my bags immediately. He yelled that he was cutting me out of the Sterling family forever, and that my name would never be spoken in this house again. He puffed out his chest and tried to summon all the commanding presence of a powerful chief executive officer. He told me that I had made a massive mistake crossing him today. He threatened to use the entire weight of Sterling Logistics to crush my pathetic little startup company. He promised to call every single business contact he had in Atlanta and personally make sure that nobody would ever hire my consulting firm again. He swore he would completely blacklist me from the corporate world and run me entirely out of the city until I was begging on the streets. I sat there and looked at the angry red face of the man who called himself a logistics titan. I looked at the absolute conviction in his eyes as he threatened to destroy a business he knew absolutely nothing about. The absurdity of the situation finally caught up with me. A soft chuckle escaped my lips. The chuckle quickly grew into a genuine full-bellied laugh. I laughed so hard that tears formed in the corners of my eyes. I laughed at the sheer comical delusion of a man who thought he had the power to crush a billionaire. My laughter bounced off the walls, confusing and infuriating my family even more. I wiped a tear from my eye and looked right at my father. I asked him if he really thought his 30-year legacy meant anything in the real world. Desmond straightened his expensive suit jacket and puffed out his chest, standing tall at the head of the dining table. He began to boast loudly about his massive fleet of commercial trucks crossing the country every single day, delivering goods and generating massive profits. He bragged about his supposedly untouchable credit score and the deep personal relationships he had built with powerful politicians and wealthy bank managers across the city of Atlanta. He said his name commanded absolute respect in every boardroom, and that a foolish, ungrateful daughter like me could never even comprehend the kind of massive financial power he wielded. He told me he had built an empire from the ground up through blood, sweat, and tears. He declared that Sterling Logistics was an immovable fortress of wealth that would outlast us all and provide for generations of the Sterling family. He gloated that his company generated tens of millions of dollars in revenue every quarter, and that he could easily squash my pathetic little consulting firm with a single phone call to his powerful golfing buddies. He looked down his nose at me, telling me that I was nothing but a minor nuisance, a buzzing insect trying to annoy a lion. He promised to make an example out of me, to show the entire city what happens when a disrespectful child tries to bite the hand that feeds them. I sat back in my heavy wooden chair and let him finish his pompous, arrogant speech. I let him paint a beautiful fake picture of his corporate dominance, while the rest of the family watched him with desperate, lingering hope. They were clinging to his words, praying that he actually had the power to protect them from the destruction I was bringing down upon their heads. When he finally paused to take a breath, his chest heaving with exertion, I reached into my luxury handbag one more time. I did not pull out another paper folder or a leather ledger. Instead, I pulled out a sleek silver iPad. I tapped the glass screen a few times to wake it up, and then I wirelessly connected it to the massive 80-inch smart television mounted on the dining room wall. The large television screen flickered to life, casting a bright, harsh glow over the remains of our Sunday dinner. The rotating family photos on the screensaver were instantly replaced by a highly detailed live financial dashboard. Bright numbers, complex graphs, and pulsing red charts illuminated the elegant dining room. I stood up from the table and walked slowly over to the television, pointing at the center of the screen. I told my father that his 30-year legacy was nothing but a hollow, rotting shell waiting to collapse. I explained to the silent table that they were looking at the live internal financial records for Sterling Logistics. I watched my father's eyes widen in absolute horror as the bright red negative numbers flashed across the screen for everyone to see. I read the figures aloud, making sure my mother and sister heard every single devastating detail. I told them that Sterling Logistics was not an immovable fortress of wealth. I revealed that the company was currently drowning in exactly $20 million of toxic, unmanageable debt. My mother let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her manicured hands. Jasmine stared at the television screen, shaking her head from side to side, as if the numbers were playing a cruel trick on her eyes. Preston and Jamal sat frozen, staring at the red charts that signaled the end of their free ride. I turned back to my father and asked him to explain the massive cash withdrawals highlighted in the bottom right corner of the financial dashboard. Desmond could not speak. He was visibly shaking, his breathing shallow and rapid as sweat beaded on his forehead. I told the room that the great Desmond Sterling, the man who stood at the pulpit every Sunday, bragging about his integrity and his blessings, had been systematically draining his own employees' pension funds. I explained that he was taking out illegal shadow loans against the retirement savings of the very truck drivers and warehouse workers who built his precious empire. I told my mother that the blood and sweat of innocent working-class families had paid for her diamond necklaces and her luxury vacations. I exposed the fact that my father was stealing from his own loyal staff just to keep his bankrupt logistics company afloat and to fund the reckless spending habits of his spoiled wife and ungrateful children. Desmond lunged forward, bracing his heavy body against the edge of the dining table. His face was completely devoid of color, looking like a man who had just seen a ghost. He pointed a shaking finger at the television screen and then turned his trembling hand toward me. His voice was hoarse and broken as he demanded to know how I had hacked into his highly secure corporate servers. He yelled that this was a massive federal crime and that I was going to spend the rest of my life in a dark prison cell for stealing classified corporate financial data. He frantically looked around the room, threatening to call the authorities and have me arrested immediately for cyber terrorism. I looked at my terrified, sweating father and smiled a chilling, triumphant smile. I told him to go ahead and call the police. I explained that I did not hack into anything and I did not steal a single piece of data. I told him I did not need to break any laws or bypass any security protocols because I had absolute legal access to every single file in his entire company. My father stared at me with wide, terrified eyes as the bright red numbers continued to flash on the television screen behind me. He swallowed hard, his throat working as he tried to process what I had just said. He stammered out a weak question asking me how a freelance computer worker could possibly have legal access to the private financial records of a massive logistics corporation. I walked slowly around the dining table, stepping over the torn pages of the ledger that Jasmine had ripped apart earlier. I stopped right behind his heavy carved chair. I told my father that it was time for a quick history lesson about his own business. I reminded him about the dark period exactly 3 years ago when Sterling Logistics was on the verge of complete collapse. I painted a vivid picture of the panic that had consumed this very house back then. Desmond had been facing a massive federal indictment for mismanaging corporate funds and failing to pay federal transport taxes. The company was days away from being seized by the government, and my father was staring down the barrel of a lengthy prison sentence. I reminded everyone at the table how Desmond had spent hours in this very dining room crying and praying to God for a miracle to save his precious legacy and keep him out of a federal penitentiary. I looked directly into his sweating face and reminded him that his prayers were seemingly answered at the absolute last minute. A mysterious private holding company based in New York had suddenly stepped in and offered him a massive financial bailout. They paid off his federal tax debts and settled the impending lawsuits quietly behind closed doors, keeping his name out of the local newspapers. My mother let out a small gasp as she remembered the elaborate celebration they had thrown in this house when the legal troubles vanished. I asked my father if he remembered the specific terms of that miraculous bailout agreement. He did not answer me, so I answered for him. I told the room that in exchange for keeping his freedom and avoiding a federal prison cell, Desmond had willingly signed over 85% of his corporate voting shares to that anonymous New York holding company. He had sold his soul and his entire empire just to keep his fancy title and his corner office. Desmond had spent the last 3 years strutting around Atlanta, pretending he was still a self-made kingpin, when in reality, he was nothing more than a glorified middle manager working for a faceless corporate entity that he knew absolutely nothing about. He assumed his silent partners did not care about the day-to-day operations as long as the trucks kept moving and the profits looked decent on paper. Desmond grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He asked me what any of that had to do with my current accusations. I reached into my handbag for the final time. I pulled out a crisp single sheet of heavy legal paper and placed it gently on the polished wood right in front of his empty plate. I told him that I was the anonymous New York holding company. I explained that the money I used to buy his failing trucking empire came directly from the massive profits I had made building Apex Capital. I told him that I did not just pay for his house and his wife's designer clothes. I told him that I literally owned him. The silence in the room was absolute and terrifying. Nobody moved an inch. Nobody even breathed. My father looked down at the single sheet of paper resting on the table. His hands were trembling so violently he could barely bring himself to touch it. His eyes scanned the official corporate letterhead and the bold black text. I did not wait for him to finish reading it. I recited the contents of the document entirely from memory, keeping my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any emotion. I told my father that the document was a formal letter of termination without cause or severance. I explained that the board of directors, which consisted entirely of my own appointed corporate proxies, had held an emergency meeting on Friday afternoon. I informed him that the board had reviewed the extensive evidence of his pension fraud and his illegal shadow loans. I told him that they had voted unanimously to terminate Desmond Sterling from his position as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately for gross financial misconduct and a massive breach of fiduciary duty. I told him he was stripped of all company privileges, access codes, and authority. My mother began to sob loudly, her shoulders shaking as the reality of my words washed over her. Jasmine sat frozen, staring blankly at the wall, as her entire world completely disintegrated before her very eyes. Preston was backing away from the table, trying to put distance between himself and the sinking ship. I looked at my father and delivered the final crushing blow. I told him that he was no longer the boss of anything. I explained that he was currently trespassing on company time, and that the corporate car parked in the driveway no longer belonged to him. I looked the proud, arrogant patriarch of the Sterling family dead in the eyes, and I fired my own father. The sheer devastation on Desmond's face was something I will never forget. The illusion of absolute power he had worn like a heavy armor for 30 years simply melted away, leaving behind a pathetic, broken old man who had destroyed his own legacy through greed and terrible incompetence. He realized in that exact moment that he had absolutely zero leverage left. He could not yell at me. He could not command me. He could not use his wealth to silence me, because all of his wealth belonged entirely to me. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, and the daughter he had treated like garbage for decades held the only key to the exit. Desmond looked desperately around the ruined dining room, searching for a way out of the suffocating humiliation. His eyes darted from his weeping wife to his ruined son-in-law, to the glowing television screen displaying his massive unpayable debts. He realized that the onslaught was not going to stop, and that I was going to strip him of every single thing he held dear in this world. Suddenly, his breathing became heavily ragged and shallow. His eyes rolled back slightly, and he let out a loud, dramatic groan that echoed through the room. Desmond brought his right hand up and clutched tightly at the center of his chest, tangling his fingers in his expensive shirt. His knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed heavily onto the expensive dining room rug, knocking over a crystal wineglass in the process. He lay there gasping loudly for air and pretending to have a massive heart attack just to garner sympathy and stop my relentless attack. My mother Beatrice let out a blood-curdling scream as my father's heavy body hit the floor. She threw herself out of her chair and dropped to her knees beside him, her designer dress soaking up the spilled red wine that was rapidly pooling on the expensive rug. She began wailing at the top of her lungs, begging Desmond to keep his eyes open and demanding that someone call an ambulance immediately. Jasmine stood frozen in the corner with her hands clamped over her mouth while Preston continued to back away toward the hallway, clearly wanting absolutely nothing to do with a medical emergency. Jamal just stared at our father in dumbfounded silence, completely paralyzed by the chaotic scene unfolding in front of him. I did not move a single muscle to help the man gasping on the floor. I stood perfectly still, watching my father put on the most pathetic theatrical performance of his entire life. He was squeezing his eyes shut and taking loud, ragged breaths, deliberately puffing out his cheeks to make it look like he was suffocating. It was a desperate, cowardly tactic designed to force me to back down and wrap the family in a blanket of panicked sympathy. He thought a medical emergency would immediately erase the fact that he had stolen millions of dollars and ruined his own logistics empire. I calmly raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once. The sharp sound cut through Mother's hysterical sobbing. The heavy oak doors leading to the outdoor patio swung open instantly. Two massive men dressed in immaculate dark suits stepped silently into the dining room. They were my private security detail, and they had been waiting patiently on the porch for the entire duration of this disastrous dinner. I pointed down at my father writhing on the rug and instructed the taller of the two men to examine him. I informed my terrified family that my head of security was a highly decorated former military combat medic who was more than qualified to handle a cardiac event. The medic stepped forward, moving with swift professional efficiency. He knelt down right next to my weeping mother and placed his large, steady hands on my father's chest. Desmond tried to keep up the charade, groaning louder and clenching his jaw, as if he were in absolute agony. The medic ignored the dramatic noises. He pressed two fingers firmly against the pulse point on my father's neck and then placed his ear near my father's mouth to monitor his breathing patterns. He checked the temperature and color of my father's skin, moving with a calm, clinical precision that made the entire room hold its collective breath. We all waited in agonizing silence as the medic finished his rapid assessment. He did not shout for a defibrillator or demand that we start chest compressions. Instead, he slowly stood up and adjusted the cuffs of his dark suit. He looked directly at me and announced in a clear, booming voice that Mr. Sterling's vital signs were absolutely perfect. He told the entire room that my father's heart rate was completely normal. His breathing was unobstructed and there were zero physiological signs of cardiac distress. He stated plainly that the man on the floor was entirely faking his medical emergency. The absolute mortification that washed over the dining room was suffocating. The frantic weeping abruptly stopped. My mother froze her hands, hovering awkwardly over my father's chest. Desmond realized that his pathetic illusion had been completely shattered by a certified medical professional. He slowly opened his eyes and looked up at the ceiling, the reality of his profound humiliation settling over him like a heavy lead weight. He had to awkwardly scramble to his feet, his expensive tailored suit now stained with dark red wine and wrinkled beyond repair. He could not even make eye contact with me or his golden son-in-law. The grand patriarch of the Sterling family had been reduced to a lying coward, caught faking a heart attack to avoid taking responsibility for his massive financial crimes. Seeing her husband completely destroyed and realizing that the corporate empire was truly lost, my mother, Beatrice, abruptly shifted her entire strategy. The arrogant, judgmental matriarch, who had just ordered me to apologize on my knees, suddenly vanished. In her place emerged a desperate, weeping woman willing to use any emotional manipulation necessary to save her luxurious lifestyle. She abandoned my humiliated father and crawled across the stained rug until she was right at my feet. She reached out and grabbed the hem of my simple black sweater, her tears flowing freely down her cheeks. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes and began to invoke the sacred bond of motherhood. She cried out that she had carried me in her womb for 9 long months, and that she had endured the pain of childbirth just to bring me into this world. She sobbed that a mother's love is completely unconditional and eternal, and she begged me to remember the time she had brushed my hair and sung me to sleep when I was a little girl. She asked me how I could possibly be so cruel to my own flesh and blood, the very people who had given me life. She wailed that the family needed to stick together and forgive each other's mistakes, pleading with me to reverse the corporate takeover and pay off Preston's shadow loans so we could all go back to being a happy, blessed family. She tried to make me feel like a monster for holding them accountable. She tried to use my basic human empathy as a weapon against me, hoping that the deep ingrained guilt of a daughter would override the cold, hard facts of their betrayal. She cried that I was breaking her heart into a million pieces, and that God would punish me for disrespecting my parents in their darkest hour of need. I looked down at the woman gripping my sweater and felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical disgust. I did not reach down to help her up. I did not offer her a tissue to dry her fake, manipulative tears. I simply reached into the pocket of my handbag and pulled out my cell phone for the final time. I told my weeping mother that her touching speech about unconditional maternal love was incredibly moving. I unlocked my screen and opened my audio files, telling her that I wanted to share a very interesting conversation I had recorded just last week. I tapped the smooth glass screen and connected my device directly to the integrated Bluetooth sound system that my father had installed in the dining room ceiling. The soft jazz music that had been playing softly in the background immediately faded into a dead, heavy silence. I looked down at my mother, who was still gripping my black sweater with her perfectly manicured hands. Her tear-filled eyes shifted from my face to the speakers hidden above us as a familiar voice suddenly echoed through the massive room. It was my mother's voice, clear as day, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers and the expensive oil paintings. She was speaking to Pastor Williams at the exclusive country club charity luncheon just last Wednesday. The high-quality audio captured the clinking of porcelain teacups and the polite, shallow chatter of the Atlanta high society. Wives in the background. My mother was laughing that high-pitched artificial laugh she reserved exclusively for church elders and wealthy donors. She told the pastor that she was absolutely humiliated by my mere existence. She complained bitterly that I was 33 years old and completely unmarriable because of my terrible aggressive personality. Then came the specific line that made the entire dining room completely freeze in absolute horror. The digital recording continued with my mother, lowering her voice into a dramatic conspiratorial whisper. She told Pastor Williams that sometimes she prayed late at night and asked God why he had deliberately cursed the Sterling family with such an ugly masculine daughter. She actually said that she wished she had miscarried me so that the family aesthetic would not have been permanently ruined by a child who refused to conform to her standard of beauty. She finished her vile little confession by stating that I was nothing but a heavy dark cloud hanging over Jasmine and Preston's perfectly beautiful white picket fence marriage. I tapped the screen again, and the audio abruptly cut off, leaving a suffocating toxic silence in its wake. I looked down at my mother, the desperate weeping woman who had just given a passionate tear-filled speech about unconditional maternal love, had completely vanished into thin air. Her fake tears dried up instantly, leaving dark streaks of expensive mascara running down her cheeks. Her hands slowly released their desperate grip on my sweater and fell limply to her sides. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking pale and incredibly old. She stared up at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that her ultimate hypocrisy had been brutally exposed to the entire room. I stepped back, creating a physical distance between myself and the pathetic woman kneeling on the wine-stained rug. I told her that her tears were absolutely insulting and that she was the most talented actress I had ever met. I explained that she had never loved me for a single second of my life and that she only loved the social status she thought a perfect wealthy family would bring her. I told her that she had sold her soul a long time ago for designer handbags, luxury vacations, and front row seats at Sunday service. I exposed the absolute truth that she cared far more about the neighborhood gossip and the approval of hypocritical church leaders than she ever cared about the mental or emotional well-being of her own flesh and blood. I told Beatrice that she was a complete and utter fraud to her very core. I reminded her that she sat in the front pew every single week, pretending to be a devout Christian woman while she was secretly harboring such venomous toxic hatred for her own child. I asked her exactly how many prayers she had faked while actively spending the massive amounts of money I quietly funneled into her personal bank accounts. I told her that the luxury SUV she drove to the country club, the diamond earrings she wore to the charity luncheons, and the very roof over her head were all paid for by the daughter. She wished she had miscarried. I watched her flinch with every single word I spoke as if she were being physically struck. She could not formulate a single word of defense. She just knelt there on the floor, completely stripped of her dignity, her maternal high ground, and her fake religious purity. The absolute destruction of my mother's carefully curated persona hung heavily in the air, suffocating the remaining pride out of the room. Everyone was entirely speechless. But while my mother was paralyzed by her public exposure, my younger brother Jamal was experiencing a completely different type of realization. Jamal had been standing near the hallway, his eyes darting frantically between the canceled platinum card on the table and the massive stack of corporate termination documents I had produced earlier. The only thing Jamal cared about was the sudden terrifying realization that the bottomless bank accounts were permanently closed, his luxury cars and his underground gambling habits were gone forever. The free ride he had enjoyed his entire life had crashed into a brick wall. The pampered golden boy of the Sterling family stared at the tablet displaying the insurmountable debt and the red numbers flashing across the television screen in his spoiled, entitled, and deeply arrogant mind. There was only one way to fix this catastrophic situation. His fists clenched at his sides and his breathing became heavy with desperate rage. Jamal realized that his gravy train was cut off and he decided to get violent. He took a slow, menacing step toward the dining table. His eyes locked entirely on the silver tablet and the heavy leather ledger that contained the absolute proof of his massive gambling debts. He did not care about the shattered family surrounding him. He only cared about maintaining his pathetic illusion of wealth and securing his next payout. He gritted his teeth and let out a growl, preparing to launch himself across the long wooden table. Jamal threw his entire body weight forward, scrambling across the polished mahogany table and knocking over crystal wine glasses. Plates of expensive roasted lamb went crashing to the hardwood floor, creating a massive mess of grease and shattered china. His eyes were wild and desperate, completely fixated on the silver iPad and the heavy leather folders that held the absolute proof of his financial ruin. He reached out his hand, wrapping his trembling fingers around a heavy silver steak knife that had been resting near my father's empty plate. He brandished the weapon recklessly, slashing it through the air as he lunged directly toward me, trying to destroy the digital dashboard and rip the physical evidence to shreds. But before my mother could even let out a full scream, and before Jamal could bring the sharp blade within 5 feet of my face, my private security detail moved with terrifying speed. The two massive men in dark suits who had just exposed my father's fake medical emergency did not even hesitate for a fraction of a second. The taller medic stepped seamlessly in front of me, forming an impenetrable human shield, while the second security officer lunged forward and grabbed Jamal by the collar of his designer shirt. In less than 2 seconds, the highly trained officer twisted my brother's arm, forcing him to drop the steak knife onto the floor with a loud metallic clatter. The officer slammed the spoiled golden boy of the Sterling family face first into the expensive dining room rug, pinning his arms behind his back with absolute clinical precision. Jamal thrashed and kicked, screaming profanities and demanding to be let go. But the security guard held him down effortlessly, placing a heavy knee between his shoulder blades. I did not flinch. I did not scream or push my chair back from the table. I simply reached out my hand, picked up my crystal glass of ice water, and took a slow, refreshing sip. I watched over the rim of my glass as the arrogant young man who had just mocked my clothes and called me a charity case was reduced to a crying, thrashing mess on the floor. The physical reality of the situation finally crashed down on the rest of my family, like a suffocating wave of ice-cold water. They stood frozen in their tracks, staring at the armed security personnel, and then looking back at me, sitting completely unbothered at the head of the ruined table. They suddenly realized that I was not just a rich relative waving around a fancy credit card. I was a completely untouchable billionaire with a private corporate security force that answered only to me. They finally understood that their social status and their loud voices meant absolutely nothing in the face of genuine ruthless power. The sheer display of physical dominance broke whatever remaining pride existed in the room. My father sat on the floor, still covered in spilled wine, watching his only son getting pinned to the rug and realizing he was utterly powerless to stop it. My mother backed away into the corner, covering her face with her hands and sobbing hysterically. Her perfect Sunday dinner had turned into a literal crime scene, and there was absolutely no way she could spin this narrative to the church gossips. The illusion of the perfect wealthy black family in Atlanta was completely shattered, leaving nothing but broken glass and terrible financial crimes in its wake. The silence that followed Jamal's defeat was heavy and absolute, broken only by his muffled crying against the floorboards. I let the silence stretch out, allowing them to stew in the complete destruction of their false reality. I wanted every single one of them to remember this exact moment for the rest of their lives. I wanted them to remember the night they tried to humiliate the wrong woman and lost everything they held dear. But the most pathetic reaction did not come from my parents or my weeping sister. It came from my white brother-in-law, Preston. Preston looked at the security guards holding Jamal down, and then looked at the extensive federal fraud documents I had laid out on the table. The arrogant real estate developer realized that his fake high society life was completely over, and that he was facing serious federal prison time for his massive financial crimes. The self-preservation instincts of a cornered rat immediately kicked in. Preston slowly stepped over the shattered glass on the floor, completely ignoring his weeping wife Jasmine and the chaotic scene unfolding around him. He nervously adjusted his tailored tie and walked toward the head of the table, keeping a very safe distance from my security team. He knew that his charm and his racial privilege would not save him from a federal indictment. He knew that I held all the cards and that I was entirely immune to his usual manipulation tactics. He looked at the ruins of the Sterling family and decided right then and there that he had absolutely no loyalty to any of them. Preston wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and adjusted his expensive silk tie. His hands were shaking slightly, but he forced his face into a mask of desperate negotiation. He carefully stepped around the puddle of spilled wine and shattered crystal, completely ignoring the pathetic whimpering of my brother Jamal, who was still pinned face down into the rug. Preston walked toward my end of the long dining table, keeping a cautious distance from my security team. Knowing physical intimidation was no longer an option, he immediately switched to the only language he truly understood: corporate survival. He leaned forward, resting his palms on the polished wood, and lowered his voice into a hushed, confidential tone. It was the exact same smooth, persuasive tone he used when swindling innocent church members out of their life savings. He looked directly into my eyes and told me that we did not need to be enemies, and that he was willing to make a mutually beneficial arrangement. Preston whispered that he had spent the last 2 years quietly copying internal emails and bank transfers from my father's logistics company. He had undeniable proof of every single illegal transaction Desmond had made involving the employee pension funds. Preston offered to hand over his entire hidden digital drive and officially testify against my father to the federal authorities. All he asked for in return was for Apex Capital to completely forgive his massive real estate debt and allow him to walk away cleanly. The arrogant real estate developer, who had just mocked my clothes an hour ago, was now ready to throw his entire family under the bus, just to save his own miserable skin. The hushed whisper was simply not quiet enough. Jasmine had been sitting frozen in her chair, her tear-streaked face buried in her trembling hands. Her entire reality had been ripped apart. But when the words "federal authorities" and "testify against your father" left her husband's mouth, she slowly raised her head. The absolute shock on her perfect face quickly twisted into pure, unadulterated rage. She realized in a split second that her supposedly flawless high society husband was completely willing to send her own father to a federal penitentiary for a decade just to save his own miserable skin. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy marriage shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. Jasmine let out an ear-piercing scream that tore through the remaining tension in the room. She lunged across the dining space, grabbing a heavy silver wine decanter from the side table and hurling it directly at Preston's head. The heavy glass missed his skull by mere inches and smashed violently into the expensive custom wallpaper behind him, spraying dark red wine everywhere, like blood from a fresh wound. She threw herself at her husband, beating her fists against his chest and screaming that he was a worthless, cowardly traitor. She shrieked that she had wasted her youth on a fraudulent loser who was now trying to send her family to prison. Preston grabbed her wrists, trying to shove her away. Moving with a harsh, violent panic, he yelled back at her, telling her that she was a spoiled, delusional brat who spent money like water. He screamed that he was absolutely not going to rot in a federal prison cell, just because her father was an incompetent, arrogant fool who did not know how to run a basic logistics company. He pushed Jasmine backward, causing her to stumble over a broken dinner plate and crash heavily into the side of the wooden dining table, her designer dress tearing at the seam. My mother. Beatrice scrambled up from the corner of the room, shrieking at Preston to take his hands off her daughter. She grabbed a heavy porcelain serving dish and threw it blindly across the room, adding to the absolute destruction of her pristine dining space. The dish shattered against a mahogany cabinet, sending sharp shards of ceramic flying across the floor. Desmond finally found his voice, rising from the floor with his face flushed a dangerous shade of purple. With absolute fury, he bellowed at Preston, calling him a backstabbing parasite and a miserable snake who had fed off the Sterling family name for years. Desmond threatened to kill Preston with his bare hands for daring to spy on his corporate accounts. The two men collided near the entrance to the kitchen, shoving each other and screaming vicious, terrible threats. Desmond grabbed Preston by the collar of his ruined suit jacket, while Preston threw a wild, desperate punch that caught my father on the shoulder. Jasmine sobbed hysterically on the floor, clutching her torn dress and screaming for them to stop, while my mother wailed loudly about the neighbors calling the police and ruining their reputation in the church community. I sat perfectly still in my high-backed chair, watching the absolute carnage unfold before me. I reached out my hand and took another slow sip of my ice water, observing the chaotic scene, like a seasoned general, watching an enemy battlefield completely disintegrate the perfect wealthy Atlanta family that had spent decades looking down their noses at me, was now physically tearing each other apart like rabid animals fighting over scraps. They were throwing expensive plates, screaming vile accusations, and exposing every single dark secret they had hidden behind their fake church smiles. For 33 years, they had constantly teamed up to break me down. They had formed a united front of toxicity, using their collective privilege and their fake status to make me feel small and worthless. But the moment genuine pressure was applied, the moment their fake money was stripped away, they turned on each other with a vicious, bloodthirsty desperation. There was no loyalty in this room. There was no familial love. There was only greed, panic, and the frantic scramble to survive the consequences of their own horrific actions. It was a symphony of destruction, and I had orchestrated every single note without even raising my voice or lifting a finger. I let them scream and shove each other for another full minute, letting them completely exhaust their pathetic reserves of false pride. I watched Preston shove my father backward, and I watched my mother desperately try to pull Jasmine off the floor, covered in spilled wine and broken glass, when the noise reached a deafening absolute crescendo, and the physical struggle seemed like it was about to spill over into the living room. I slowly placed my crystal water glass down on the table. I did not shout to be heard over the chaos. I did not beg for their attention. I simply raised my right hand into the air, holding it perfectly still, palm facing the center of the room. The effect was instantaneous. The screaming died violently in their throats. Preston froze with his hands gripping my father's lapels. Desmond stopped his furious advance, completely paralyzed by the simple gesture. Jasmine stopped her hysterical, sobbing, choking on a breath. The entire ruined dining room fell absolutely dead silent. Their chests were heaving, their expensive clothes were ruined, and their eyes were locked entirely on my raised hand. They stood amidst the wreckage of their fake upper class, lives completely terrified of what I was going to do to them next. My raised hand hovered in the air for just a moment longer before I slowly lowered it back to my side, resting it against the smooth leather of my designer handbag. The entire ruined dining room remained absolutely dead silent. Their chests were heaving, their expensive clothes were ruined, and their eyes were locked entirely on my every move. They stood amidst the wreckage of their fake upper-class lives, completely terrified of what I was going to do to them next. Jasmine was still slumped against the heavy wooden dining table, her breathing ragged and loud in the suffocating quiet of the room. Her perfect facade had been completely obliterated. The flawless golden child of the Sterling family, the woman who had spent 35 years looking down her nose at everyone she deemed beneath her, was now nothing more than a broken, sobbing mess. She stared at Preston, her cheating, fraudulent husband, who had just tried to sell out her own father to the federal authorities just to save his own miserable skin. She realized with absolute clarity that the fairy tale marriage she had flaunted on social media and at every church gathering was nothing but an empty, decaying shell. Preston did not even look at her. He kept his pale gray eyes fixed entirely on me, waiting for my response to his pathetic plea deal. The reality of her total destruction finally broke whatever remained of Jasmine's pride. She looked at the shattered crystal on the floor, at our father clutching his chest in genuine panic, at our mother weeping in the corner, and finally her eyes locked onto me. The sister she had mocked, called a failure and publicly humiliated, less than an hour ago, was now the absolute ruler of her universe. Slowly, painfully, Jasmine crawled forward over the ruined rug, the torn fabric of her expensive designer dress, dragged through the spilled red wine and grease from the roasted lamb. But she did not care anymore. She dragged herself across the floor until she reached the base of my chair. She reached out with trembling, wine-stained hands and grabbed the hem of my simple black sweater. The very same sweater she had laughed at and called cheap charity clothing. Jasmine tilted her head back and looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her perfect makeup and leaving dark streaks across her cheeks. She begged me in a hoarse, broken whisper not to let the bank take her beautiful house in Buckhead. She cried that she would be entirely homeless, that she would be an absolute laughingstock in Atlanta high society, and that the women at the church would completely destroy her reputation. She sobbed that her life was entirely over if Preston went to a federal prison and left her drowning in millions of dollars of unpayable debt. She pleaded with me to use the power of Apex Capital to just pay off the shadow loans and save her from total public humiliation. She promised she would do anything I wanted. She promised she would treat me with respect. She promised she would never say another cruel word to me for the rest of her life. I sat perfectly still, looking down at the desperate woman clinging to my clothes. I felt absolutely no sympathy for her. I remembered all the years of her constant bullying, all the times she had joined forces with my mother to tear down my self-esteem, and all the moments she had smiled while Preston delivered his racially coded insults. I remembered how she had tapped her crystal wine glass at the beginning of this very dinner to make sure everyone was paying attention before she tried to publicly humiliate me one more time. I thought about how easily she had tossed me aside whenever it benefited her, and how quickly she had turned into a weeping victim the second her fake wealth was stripped away. I looked directly into Jasmine's tear-filled eyes, and I kept my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. I asked her what it felt like to be a failure without a husband. I repeated the exact same question she had thrown in my face when she thought I was nothing but a struggling tech support worker. I watched her eyes widen in fresh horror as she realized her own toxic words were coming back to completely destroy her. I methodically reached down and grabbed the fabric of my black sweater, pulling it firmly and decisively out of her desperate grip. I told her that I honestly did not know what it felt like to be a miserable, lonely failure, but that she was absolutely about to find out firsthand. Jasmine collapsed forward, burying her face in her hands and wailing loudly against the hardwood floor. My mother tried to crawl toward her to comfort her, but was too paralyzed by the shock of my coldness to even move. My father just stared blankly at the wall, his logistics empire and his family completely in ruins. Preston tried to speak again, reminding me of his pathetic offer to testify against my father, but I silenced him with a single sharp look. I told them all that I was not here to save their reputations or pay for their mistakes. I explained that their terrible choices had finally caught up to them and that the bill was entirely past due. The oppressive weight of reality settled over the Sterling family, leaving them completely suffocated by their own greed. They had built an empire of lies, and now they were trapped in the rubble. I reached into my luxury handbag for the absolute final time tonight, my fingers wrapping around the thickest and most devastating folder of them all. I pulled out a heavy stack of legal documents printed on crisp white paper and bound with heavy metal clips. I tossed the stack onto the polished dining table, right on top of the shattered porcelain plates and the ruined Sunday dinner. I informed my weeping sister and my terrified parents that they were looking at the final eviction notices for every single property they falsely claimed to own. Preston took a step back, his face draining of whatever color it had left when he saw the thick stack of papers. He knew exactly what those legal binders looked like. Desmond let out a weak, pathetic sound from his place on the floor, finally understanding that his pristine suburban mansion was included in that stack of papers. Beatrice clutched her pearl necklace, as if the jewelry could somehow protect her from being thrown out onto the street. The family that had prided themselves on their material wealth was now staring at the physical proof of their impending homelessness. What does it feel like to be 33 empty-handed and completely undesirable? My older sister asked, tapping her crystal wine glass to make sure the entire dining room was listening to my humiliation. I did not cry. I just looked at her perfect designer dress and asked my own specific question. What does it feel like when this undesirable failure finally stops paying for that dress and every single other bill in this fake house? My name is Chloe Sterling, and for 15 agonizing years I have been the sacrificial lamb of my family. We were gathered for our sacred Sunday dinner at my parents' sprawling estate in the wealthiest zip code of Atlanta. The dining room smelled of expensive catered soul food and fresh-cut lilies, but the atmosphere was suffocatingly toxic. Jasmine, my sister, sat across from me, soaking in the spotlight. She was the golden child, The one my parents proudly paraded in front of the megachurch congregation every single week to prove how blessed they were. Beside her sat Preston, her white husband, who worked in high-end real estate development. Preston loved to use his privilege to talk down to me at every given opportunity. He rolled up the sleeves of his tailored shirt, making absolutely sure everyone at the mahogany table got a good look at his brand new Rolex. He stared at my plain black sweater and let out a heavy, condescending sigh before flashing a smile that never quite reached his cold gray eyes. "You know," Chloe Preston said, his voice dripping with weaponized pity, "my firm is actually looking for a new receptionist. The pay is barely above minimum wage, but it is certainly better than whatever freelance tax prep nonsense you are doing right now. You could answer phones and fetch my coffee. It would get you out of those cheap charity shop clothes and finally take some of the heavy financial burden off your aging parents." My mother. Beatrice nodded enthusiastically from the head of the table, adjusting her authentic pearl necklace and giving me a look of profound disgust. "You should really get on your knees and thank Preston for that offer, Chloe." She said, her voice sharp and unforgiving. "He is being incredibly generous, taking pity on you. Not every woman is lucky enough to snag a top-tier wealthy provider, like your sister. Did you need to stop being so stubbornly independent and accept your place? Look at Jasmine and Preston. They just closed on a $2 million mansion in Buckhead. That is what real black excellence looks like." My father, Desmond, carved his expensive steak heavily. He ran Sterling Logistics, a trucking empire that supposedly made him an untouchable kingpin in our local community. He pointed his silver steak knife directly at my chest. "Your mother is absolutely right," he growled. "This family is about building a powerful legacy. Jasmine and Preston are out here, making a respected name for the Sterlings. Meanwhile, you are 33 years old, living in some tiny apartment hiding behind a computer screen all day. When will you stop playing around with pathetic internet hobbies and get a real career? Your presence is deeply embarrassing us." My younger brother Jamal snickered loudly through a mouthful of expensive food. He was 28, completely unemployed and a raging gambling addict. But my parents treated him like royalty, simply because he was their only son. Jamel tossed his linen napkin onto his plate and eagerly joined the firing squad. "Yeah, Chloe. Maybe if you dressed like a real woman and stopped acting so aggressive and bitter all the time, you could find a guy to tolerate you. But right now, you are just the pathetic family." Charity case. I looked slowly around the massive dining room at these people who shared my DNA. I looked at their smug, arrogant faces, their flashy diamond jewelry, and their expensive crystal wine glasses. My hands resting quietly on my lap did not shake or tremble. My heart, which used to literally ache for just an ounce of their approval, felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical detachment. They honestly thought they were looking at a struggling, broke freelancer who could barely afford to keep the lights on. They had absolutely no idea that I was the sole founder and chief executive officer of Apex Capital, a private equity firm managing over $1 billion in assets. I let them laugh at me. I let the sickening sound of their mockery fill the massive room, bouncing off the walls of the house I secretly owned. Then I reached for my linen napkin and slowly dabbed the corners of my mouth. I placed my silver fork down on the table with a soft, deliberate click that somehow cut right through all of their obnoxious noise. The room quieted down, just a fraction, as they eagerly waited for my usual defensive, tearful response. Instead, I looked directly into Jasmine's smug eyes and offered her a calm, perfectly pleasant smile. "What does it feel like to be a failure without a husband?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level and completely devoid of any emotion whatsoever. "I am not quite sure, Jasmine. But would you like to know what it feels like when this failure decides to stop paying all of this family's bills?" For 2 seconds, the entire room was dead silent. The only sound was the soft jazz music playing from the ceiling speakers. Then Preston threw his head back and let out a loud, barking laugh. "Are you out of your mind?" Preston scoffed, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "You pay the bills. That is the most delusional thing I have ever heard you make. $50,000 a year doing tech support. Your father owns a multi-million-dollar trucking empire." Jasmine and I are moving into a gated community. Who exactly do you think you are funding? Preston stood there with his hands shaking uncontrollably as he held the thick manila envelope I had specifically handed to him. The eviction notice for his $2 million Buckhead mansion was already a devastating blow. But I had saved the absolute best for last. I looked at him and told him to open the envelope because our business transaction was not quite finished yet. The entire room watched as he ripped open the flap, his hands trembling so badly that he tore the thick paper inside. He found a single sheet of paper with a federal confirmation code, a list of case numbers, and a tracking receipt. I watched the deep confusion wash over his face before I calmly explained exactly what he was holding. I told him that I did not just call his massive shadow loans and take his luxury house. I told him that on Friday afternoon, my legal team had submitted a 300-page dossier directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I let my words sink into the suffocating atmosphere of the dining room as I listed out his exact crimes, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. I told the entire room that the massive dossier contained unredacted proof of his systemic wire fraud, his reckless embezzlement, and the exact offshore routing numbers he used to hide the stolen money. I made sure my father heard me when I explained that Preston had specifically targeted the hardworking black church members my father had introduced him to, draining their retirement accounts to fund his mistresses and his sports cars. I explained that my cybersecurity division at Apex had tracked every single digital footprint he ever left. They uncovered every fake shell company, every fraudulent wire transfer, and every forged signature he used to steal from the very community he pretended to respect. I told him that I had handed all of it over to the federal authorities wrapped in a neat little bow, and that the feds were likely freezing his remaining assets and preparing his arrest warrant at this very moment. The arrogant white real estate developer, who had spent his entire adult life coasting on his racial privilege and looking down on my family, suddenly realized that no amount of smooth talking or country club connections could save him from the United States government. He realized that he was not just losing his fake wealth, he was going to spend the next 20 years rotting in a federal penitentiary. The panic in his pale gray eyes quickly morphed into pure, unadulterated, venomous rage. His face turned a violent shade of purple, the veins in his neck bulging visibly against his expensive silk tie. All the polite society manners and the fake corporate charm melted away completely, leaving only the ugly, hateful core of the man my sister had married. Preston lost absolute control of his carefully curated mask. He lunged toward me, ignoring the massive security guards flanking my chair, and screamed at the top of his lungs, hurling a vile, vicious racial slur directly at my face. The horrific word echoed off the crystal chandeliers and the ruined walls of the dining room, stunning the rest of the family into absolute frozen shock. Even Jasmine gasped in horror, realizing the monster she had married. But before the disgusting sound could even fade from the air, my security detail moved with terrifying brutal efficiency. The towering combat medic grabbed Preston by the collar of his tailored suit jacket, twisting the expensive fabric tight against his throat, cutting off his air supply, while the second security officer seized him by his heavy leather belt. They lifted the grown man entirely off his feet, making him look like a helpless, pathetic rag doll. Preston thrashed and kicked violently, screaming obscenities and threatening to sue them all. But my guards were absolute professionals, and they did not care about his empty threats. They dragged him effortlessly across the ruined dining room rug, his expensive leather shoes scraping against the hardwood floor, pulling him roughly through the grand foyer of the house I legally owned. Jasmine shrieked, trailing behind them, crying hysterically as she watched her perfect high society husband get treated like a common criminal. She begged the guards to stop, but they completely ignored her pleas. My guards kicked open the heavy oak front doors, letting the cold, wet Atlanta night air rush into the stifling, toxic house. A heavy thunderstorm had rolled in during the dinner, leaving the sprawling driveway completely slick with freezing rain. The medic did not hesitate for a single second. He hurled Preston out the door with immense force, sending the arrogant fraud flying through the humid night air. Preston crashed face first onto the unforgiving wet concrete of the driveway, his face smacking against the cold, hard ground, tearing his expensive clothes and scraping his skin against the sharp gravel. He let out a pathetic groan of pain, rolling over in the freezing rain as the water soaked through his ruined suit, destroying the last shred of his dignity. I walked slowly to the front entrance and stood in the doorway, looking down at him, illuminated by the bright security lights. He looked up at me, gasping for air, spitting blood onto the driveway, looking exactly like the miserable, desperate failure he truly was. I ordered the guards to close the doors leaving Preston out in the storm where he belonged. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut, sealing out the noise of his pathetic sobbing and the relentless pouring rain. The silence in the grand foyer was heavy and absolute, broken only by Jasmine's quiet whimpering against the wall. She slid down onto the floor, realizing that the man she had chosen over her own sister was gone forever, and that she was left with absolutely nothing but debt and total humiliation. I did not offer her a hand. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I turned slowly on my designer heels, the sound echoing sharply against the tile floor, and walked calmly back into the ruined dining room where my completely destroyed parents and my trembling brother were waiting for my absolute final goodbye. The heavy oak doors remained firmly shut, sealing the cold rain and the pathetic cries of the man my sister married outside where they belonged. I turned away from the grand entryway, the echo of my designer heels striking the polished marble floor, piercing the suffocating silence of the house. I slowly walked back toward the dining room, the battlefield where the illusion of the Sterling family had just been permanently dismantled. My security detail fell into step silently behind me, their presence, a constant physical reminder of the untouchable power I now yielded when I crossed the threshold back into the dining space. The absolute devastation was staggering to witness. My mother, Beatrice, was no longer the arrogant church-going socialite who had sat at the head of the table, judging my plain clothes and my supposed lack of ambition. She was reduced to a crumbling, weeping shell of a woman kneeling amid the shattered porcelain and spilled red wine. Her expensive pearl necklace hung sideways, and her chest heaved with heavy, uncontrollable sobs. My father, Desmond, the great logistics kingpin of Atlanta, sat slumped against the wall, looking completely hollowed out, the deep wrinkles on his face suddenly appearing years older as the reality of his impending federal investigations and immediate homelessness finally crushed the last remaining ounce of his tyrannical pride. Even Jamal, my spoiled younger brother, remained frozen on the rug, too terrified of my security team to even breathe too heavily. I stood at the head of the ruined mahogany table, looking down at the very people who had given me life, and then spent the next 33 years trying to make me feel completely worthless. My mother reached out a trembling hand toward me, sobbing my name and begging for mercy. She pleaded with me to remember the bond of blood, to remember the long history we shared, and to remember that we were a family that always takes care of its own, despite our flaws. I looked at her tear-stained face and her ruined designer clothes, and I felt an overwhelming wave of absolute clinical emptiness. I told her that the word family meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I explained that for my entire adult life, I had treated this toxic family like a fragile business venture, investing my time, my money, my energy, and my sanity, hoping that one day I would finally see a real return on my massive investment, hoping that one day I would finally earn their genuine love and respect. But the only thing I ever received in return was public humiliation, emotional abuse, and endless manipulation. I kept my voice completely devoid of any anger or sadness, delivering my final verdict with the cold, calculated precision of a ruthless corporate executive. I told them that looking at the shattered glass, the spilled wine, and the staggering financial crimes laid out on the table, I finally realized what they truly were to me. I told my weeping mother and my broken father that they were no longer my family. They were simply terrible, toxic investments that had completely drained my resources. For the very last time, I explained that, in the ruthless world of private equity, when an asset becomes a massive, unrecoverable liability, you do not keep pouring your hard-earned money into it, trying to save a sinking ship. You cut your losses immediately, you liquidate the remaining assets, and you permanently walk away without a single ounce of regret. I told them with absolute finality that I was officially writing them all off as a total loss. Desmond let out a choked, agonizing sob, shaking his head in absolute disbelief as his entire logistics empire and his fake church reputation officially crumbled to dust, right in front of his eyes. I looked directly into his defeated gaze and told him that tomorrow morning, the federal auditors would arrive to strip his fraudulent company down to its bare studs, and that he would finally have to answer to the hard-working people he had stolen from to fund this fake lifestyle. I looked at Jamal, who was staring at the floor in pathetic silence, too terrified of my guards to even move a muscle, and I told him that he was finally going to have to get a real job because his limitless bank account was permanently closed. I reminded him that the violent underground debt collectors he owed money to would no longer be held at bay by my anonymous wire transfers, and they would be looking for him by morning. I made it incredibly clear that from this exact second forward, they were completely on their own in a very cold and unforgiving world. I did not wait for their pathetic weeping apologies or their desperate empty promises to change because I knew deep down that none of it was real. They were only sorry that the endless flow of money had completely stopped and that their fake high society image in Atlanta was permanently destroyed. I raised my hand and signaled to the towering combat medic standing quietly by the dining room door. I instructed him to gather my cashmere coat from the grand hallway closet. The medic moved with swift, silent efficiency, retrieving my expensive coat and holding it open for me. I slipped my arms into the soft, warm fabric, adjusting the collar perfectly against my neck. I did not spare another glance at the weeping woman kneeling on the floor or the broken man leaning helplessly against the expensive wallpaper. I slowly walked through the absolute wreckage of the dining room, making sure my designer heels stepped directly over the torn financial documents, the spilled grease from the expensive catering, and the shattered crystal wine glasses that had been used to openly mock me just an hour ago. I stepped right over the broken, fragile pieces of the Sterling family legacy, leaving the suffocating, toxic atmosphere behind me, completely immune to the frantic begging and loud sobbing that echoed desperately through the massive house. I walked back out into the grand foyer, leaving the heavy wooden doors to the dining room wide open behind me, exposing their ruin to the rest of the world. My private security detail flanked me perfectly as I approached the heavy oak front doors. One of the trained guards reached out and pulled the massive doors open, letting the cool, crisp night air of Atlanta wash over my face, chasing away the sickening smell of roasted meat and fake church perfumes. The violent thunderstorm had finally passed, leaving behind a clean, freshly washed evening sky and the faint sound of distant city traffic. I stepped out onto the wide stone porch, breathing in the deep, refreshing scent of absolute freedom. I did not look back at the grand suburban mansion that I legally owned, and I did not care about the miserable, broken people crying hysterically inside of it. I just kept walking forward down the wet driveway toward the waiting armored Maybach, ready to leave the nightmare entirely in the past and drive toward a future where I owed them absolutely nothing. The heavy rain had finally slowed to a gentle, misty drizzle, leaving the warm Atlanta evening feeling incredibly crisp and washed completely clean. I stood on the edge of the sprawling stone porch, letting the cool breeze hit my face. It was a stark, incredible contrast to the suffocating, toxic atmosphere I had just escaped inside that dining room. The air in there had been thick with decades of lies, fake church morality, and suffocating expectations. But out here under the clearing night sky, I could finally breathe without feeling like I was choking on my own family expectations. The armored black Maybach sat, idling quietly at the end of the long circular driveway, the sleek dark paint gleaming under the security lights. My lead driver stood by the open rear passenger door, holding a large black umbrella and waiting with absolute professional patience. I pulled my cashmere coat a little tighter around my shoulders, feeling a profound sense of physical and emotional lightness that I had never experienced before in my entire 33 years of existence. As I began to walk down the wet concrete steps, my eyes caught the pathetic scene unfolding near the front gates. Preston was still trying to scrape himself off the rough gravel, his tailored suit completely ruined by the mud and the blood leaking from his scraped face. The front doors of the mansion suddenly burst open behind me, and Jasmine came running out into the rain. She did not run toward me to beg for forgiveness. She ran straight past me, slipping in her designer heels to get to the man who had just tried to send our father to federal prison. I stopped halfway down the driveway and watched through the darkness as my older sister began hitting Preston with her bare fists, screaming into the wet night air. She cursed him for ruining her high society reputation, for leaving her drowning in millions of dollars of debt, and for exposing her as a complete fraud to the entire community. Preston weakly tried to push her away, but he was too broken and too terrified of the impending federal indictment to even put up a real fight. I watched the pathetic destruction of their fake perfect marriage play out right there on the wet pavement. But they were not the only ones completely losing their minds off to the side near the manicured rose bushes. My unemployed younger brother Jamal had stumbled out of the house. He was pacing back and forth, pulling at his hair and letting out loud, frustrated screams. The realization that his endless gravy train was permanently derailed had finally driven him over the edge of sanity. He marched over to a decorative stone garden gnome that my mother had proudly placed near the flower beds and began kicking it furiously with his expensive sneakers. He kicked the heavy stone ornament over and over again, shattering the painted ceramic into tiny pieces, screaming that it was all entirely unfair. The spoiled golden child was having a literal temper tantrum in the rain because he finally had to face the real world without my anonymous money shielding him from his own terrible choices. I did not feel an ounce of pity for any of them. I turned away from the chaotic, screaming mess and continued my walk down the driveway. The driver nodded respectfully as I approached, keeping the umbrella perfectly positioned to shield me from the lingering drizzle. I slid into the luxurious leather back seat of the armored vehicle, the heavy reinforced door closing behind me with a solid, comforting thud, shutting out the noise of my sister's screaming and my brother's pathetic tantrums instantly. The interior of the car was a sanctuary of total silence and peace. The faint smell of expensive leather and the soft ambient lighting wrapped around me like a protective shield. I leaned back against the plush headrest and let out a long, slow breath. My security detail quickly loaded into the trailing SUV, and my driver smoothly shifted the Maybach into gear, looking at me through the rearview mirror to confirm we were ready to depart. I gave him a single nod, and the powerful engine purred quietly to life. We glided smoothly down the long driveway, the tires hissing gently against the wet asphalt, through the heavily tinted windows. I watched the burning wreckage of the Hayes family slowly fade away into the dark, stormy night. They were still out there on the lawn, screaming, crying, and physically fighting each other, completely trapped in the massive prison of lies they had built for themselves. But I was finally moving forward, leaving the toxic history completely in the rearview mirror. I closed my eyes as the car turned onto the main road, heading toward a future entirely of my own making. The soft hum of the tires against the wet pavement felt like a victorious melody, playing just for me. I watched the sprawling mansions of the wealthy Atlanta suburbs roll past my window, knowing that the people living inside them would soon read about the absolute downfall of the Sterling family. The truth was going to spread like absolute wildfire through the church community and the elite social circles my mother cared so desperately about they would all know that the glamorous facade was entirely funded by the very daughter they had consistently cast aside and mocked as a pathetic failure. The heavy weight that I had carried on my shoulders for my entire adult life was permanently lifted, leaving behind a fierce, untamed sense of absolute power. I rested my head against the cool glass, watching the city lights blur into bright streaks of color. The dark storm clouds above were finally breaking apart, revealing a clear, brilliant sky, setting the ultimate stage for a completely different and utterly satisfying new reality. Exactly 3 months later, when the heavy dust finally settled for good in the end. Exactly 3 months had passed since that storm washed away the fake foundation of the Hayes family, and the reality that replaced their perfect illusion was absolutely brutal. I sat in my new corner office in a towering glass skyscraper in Manhattan, overlooking the bustling streets of New York City, a world away from the suffocating fake smiles of Atlanta. My desk was made of solid black marble, and the only things on it were a sleek laptop, a cup of black coffee, and a secure phone that rarely rang with personal calls. I had completely relocated the headquarters of Apex Capital, and leaving the South behind was the best decision I ever made. The consequences for the people who used to call themselves my family unfolded exactly as I had planned, with the cold and unforgiving efficiency of the American legal and financial systems. Preston did not just lose his $2 million mansion in Buckhead, he lost his absolute freedom entirely. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission had completely torn through the massive dossier I provided them. They found even more offshore accounts and shell companies than I originally reported. Because Preston was considered a severe flight risk and had a history of moving stolen money internationally, the federal judge flatly denied his bail request. The arrogant white real estate developer, who used to sit at my parents' dining table mocking my plain clothes, was now sitting in a federal holding facility, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit, waiting for a trial that would undoubtedly send him away for the next 2 decades. None of his wealthy country club friends stepped up to help him, and his high society connections abandoned him the second the feds raided his offices. Jasmine was hit the absolute hardest by her husband's spectacular downfall. The federal government seized every single asset tied to Preston's name, which included her luxury cars, her designer jewelry, and the bank accounts she used to fund her fake rich lifestyle. Without my anonymous money to save her from ruin, and with Preston facing federal prison, Jasmine was left entirely destitute. The woman who used to brag about her exclusive shopping trips was forced to beg for a minimum wage job just to keep herself from living on the streets. She was currently working as a part-time cashier at a high-end boutique she used to frequent, serving the very same women who used to be her friends. She had to stand on her feet all day, scanning expensive dresses for women who looked at her with pure pity and whispered about her behind her back. The Atlanta high society she worshipped had completely turned their backs on her, treating her like an absolute outcast. My parents, Desmond and Beatrice, suffered a completely different kind of public execution. The morning after I fired my father, the auditors marched into his logistics company and exposed his massive pension fraud to the entire world. The local news ran the story for weeks, detailing how the prominent church-going businessman had stolen from his own hardworking employees to fund his fake luxurious lifestyle. The resulting bankruptcy completely wiped out whatever remaining assets they had left. The massive suburban estate was foreclosed and auctioned off, and all of their luxury vehicles were repossessed by the banks. My parents were forced to move into a tiny run-down 2-bedroom apartment in a dangerous part of town, a far cry from the gated communities they were used to. Desmond tried to reach out to his former business partners for small loans, but he was universally laughed out of their offices. The worst punishment for my parents, however, was not the loss of their money, but the total loss of their fake holy reputation. The congregation at their megachurch, the very people they had desperately tried to impress by looking down on me, completely banished them. The pastor publicly condemned Desmond for stealing from his own community, and my mother was stripped of all her titles in the church committees. They were absolute pariahs, forced to walk with their heads down in a city where they used to walk like royalty. As for my younger brother Jamal, he had to flee the state entirely when his violent bookies realized my money was never coming back. He was currently working manual labor under a fake name somewhere in the Midwest, jumping at every single shadow. I turned my attention back to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my Manhattan office, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace. My secure private phone suddenly buzzed against the marble desk, breaking the quiet atmosphere of the room. It was a notification for a blocked voicemail that had been routed through my security screening system. I slowly picked up the phone and tapped the screen, pressing the device against my ear to listen. It was my mother, Beatrice. Her voice was completely unrecognizable, stripped of all its former arrogance and fake church sweetness. She was sobbing hysterically into the receiver, her breath hitching as she spoke. She begged me to just listen to her for 1 minute. She cried that they had absolutely no money left for basic groceries, and that the heat in their tiny apartment had been shut off because they could not pay the utility bill. She wailed that my father was suffering from severe stress and could not afford his heart medication. She pleaded with me, invoking God and motherhood, begging me to send just a few $100s so they could survive the week. She promised she would never ask for anything else and swore she finally understood how wrong they had all been. I listened to her desperate, pathetic tears echoing through the speaker of my phone sitting in an office that overlooked the financial capital of the world. I searched my heart looking for even a single shred of pity or guilt or daughterly obligation. I found absolutely nothing. They had spent 33 years watching me suffer while they lived like kings on my dime. They had mocked my pain, laughed at my struggles, and told me I was a failure who embarrassed them. They did not love me. They only loved the money I secretly provided. I slowly pulled the phone away from my ear, looking at the screen showing the desperate voicemail recording. I did not hesitate for a single second. I firmly pressed the button to delete the message, permanently erasing her pathetic weeping from my life forever. I set the phone back down on the desk, feeling nothing but absolute clarity and power just as my office door softly clicked open and my executive assistant walked into the room carrying a freshly printed glossy magazine. My executive assistant. Amanda walked across the thick plush carpet of my office, her heels completely silent against the expensive fabric. She had a wide, proud smile on her face as she approached my solid black marble desk. She gently placed the pristine magazine right in front of me, sliding it perfectly into my line of sight. It was the highly anticipated annual billionaire issue of Forbes magazine. The glossy cover caught the ambient light of the room, and there staring back at me was my own face. I looked absolutely untouchable wearing a bespoke tailored suit, my posture exuding pure, unadulterated power and total control. Printed in bold, elegant letters, right beneath my portrait was the headline, "The Silent Titan. How Chloe Sterling Conquered Wall Street on Her Own Terms." I stared at the headline for a long time, letting the massive weight of those words fully sink into my reality. The silent titan, that was exactly who I had been for all those agonizing years while my family screamed and bragged and tore me down at every Sunday dinner. I had worked in absolute silence. I built an impenetrable empire, while they built a flimsy house of cards out of lies and stolen money. They thought my silence meant I was weak. They thought my plain clothes and my quiet demeanor meant I was a pathetic failure who could not secure a wealthy husband to save my life. But in reality, my silence was just the sound of me meticulously laying the heavy bricks of my own financial fortress. Amanda softly congratulated me on the cover feature before turning around and quietly exiting the massive office, leaving me completely alone with my victory. I reached out and traced my fingers over the smooth, glossy paper, feeling a profound sense of validation that had absolutely nothing to do with my toxic family. This magazine cover was not meant to prove anything to them. They were already erased from my timeline, completely irrelevant to my present and my future. This cover was simply the universe acknowledging the relentless hard work, the sleepless nights, and the unbreakable spirit of a Black woman who absolutely refused to be crushed by the very people who were supposed to protect her. I slowly stood up from my leather executive chair, leaving the magazine resting perfectly on the dark marble. I walked over to the custom-built bar nestled in the quiet corner of my spacious office. My hands did not shake as I reached for a bottle of perfectly aged vintage wine that cost more than my parents. First house. I selected a delicate crystal glass, the genuine kind, not the cheap, fragile stuff my sister Jasmine used to tap with her fork to get everyone's attention, the smooth, dark liquid, poured with a rich, deep color completely untainted by any of the bitterness of my past. I did not need to pour a glass for anyone else. My own company was finally more than enough. I took the crystal glass and walked slowly over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that wrapped around my entire corner office. The view was absolutely breathtaking. The sprawling, endless concrete jungle of New York City stretched out before me, bathed in the golden fading light of the late afternoon. The towering skyscrapers, the busy avenues, and the rushing rivers of traffic all looked so small from all the way up here. I stood at the absolute pinnacle of the financial world entirely by my own merit. Nobody handed this to me. No wealthy white husband financed my life, and no fake church reputation paved my way. I built every single inch of this reality with my own two hands and my own brilliant mind. I brought the crystal glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of the perfectly aged wine, letting the complex flavors settle on my tongue. The taste was exquisite, rich, and completely satisfying. Standing there looking out over the empire I had conquered, my mind drifted back to that suffocating dining room in Atlanta, just 3 months ago. I remembered the sickening smell of the roasted lamb, the sound of the mocking laughter, and the arrogant, smug look on my sister's face when she thought she had pushed me to my absolute breaking point. I remembered the way they all looked at me with such overwhelming pity and disgust, convinced that I was the stain on their perfect legacy. I remembered the exact words my sister used to try and humiliate me in front of all those people. What does it feel like to be a failure without a husband? The question echoed in my mind one last time, but it no longer carried any venom or pain. It was just a pathetic echo from a ghost I had permanently exorcised from my life. I looked down at the bustling city below me, holding my wine glass steady, and I answered her question in the total peace and quiet of my penthouse office. What does it feel like to be a failure? I whispered to the empty, luxurious room. I wouldn't know, but I do know what freedom feels like, and it feels like $1 billion. I took another slow sip of the wine, feeling the warm, satisfying burn slide down my throat. There were no lingering doubts hiding in the back of my mind. There was absolutely no desire for forgiveness, and no quiet urge to reach back out and save them from the miserable fate they had actively chosen for themselves. They were exactly where they deserved to be, and I was exactly where I belonged. The heavy, suffocating chains of the Sterling family legacy were permanently shattered, leaving me with nothing but absolute flawless victory. As the golden hour faded into a brilliant twilight over the Manhattan skyline, my new life stretched out before me, limitless and entirely mine. The screen of my past finally faded to a quiet, peaceful black. The greatest lesson we can learn from this story is that your true worth is never defined by the toxic people who continually refuse to see it, even if they are your own family. Blood does not give anyone the right to tear you down or use you for their own selfish financial gain. Absolute power comes from bravely walking away from the tables, where genuine respect is no longer being served. Sometimes you must build your own massive empire in total silence and let your ultimate success be the only noise you ever make to protect your inner peace. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe in cutting off toxic relatives to protect your future.